I know, Mark said, his eyes searching the mist-covered Mana Lake. And there's a terror-ranked leech lurking in the water. I'll do my best to distract them, and we'll just have to pray that they don't notice you for those 10 seconds. In fact, try to stay as low as possible and avoid being seen. If we can cut the mana flow off, that'll do a lot to help us. Licking his lips, Batten nodded.
You know, I still think we should have gathered everybody else, but we're here, so let's do this.
The three of them split up, Mark beginning to make his way down to the cavern floor, while the other two crept along the catwalks, staying low as they approached the observation posts. Phoenix was heading for a post just above ground level, while Batten was heading for one higher up. Both of them would take at least a few minutes to arrive, which gave Mark time to work his way closer. As he reached the bottom of the stairs and began scanning the cavern, looking for places to hide, he felt something shift behind him. Glancing back, he saw Mime crouched in his shadow. Her eyes were gleaming, and her pink tongue slid across her lips as she stared past Mark toward the nest. I know you want to eat it, Mark said, but that might not be an option. Please don't do anything crazy. Giving him an offended look, Mime swished her tail and began to creep forward, staying low. As she wove her way toward a pile of discarded pipes, Mark followed her, crawling on his stomach to try to avoid being spotted. About halfway to the pipes, he froze in place as he caught sight of a large shell looming in the glowing mist. Moving much slower than Mark expected, the giant Exlian leech crept by. Its eye stalks drooped, and it had a listless aura. As it continued past, making a loop around the stalagmite, Mark saw a large section of its shell had been crushed, undoubtedly by the crab's claw. Mark was surprised to see such a terrible wound, as he had assumed that the leech had the upper hand. It appeared the crab's vitality was not to be underestimated. As the leech finished its path around the stalagmite and vanished into the mist, Mark offered up a quiet prayer for Lieutenant Langford and Sergeant Kinsey. With the giant threat having passed, he continued forward until he made it to the pile of pipes. From there, he could see a faint path made of scattered stones that crossed the pool of mana-infused water, as well as the rough outline of steps leading up the side of the stalagmite to the top. From what he understood, nests were horrifically dangerous and would try to absorb anything that got close. Yet, that didn't coincide with what Mark had read in the research facility's observation logs. The scientists had been able to interact with the nest without any trouble whatsoever. That got Mark wondering. If nests were intelligent, would it be possible to communicate with them? Was there a chance that humanity was actually going about this all wrong? No sooner had the thought occurred to him than he felt Mime's paw whack him in the head. The blow was sudden and hard enough that Mark's head bobbed, smacking against the ground. Ow! He hissed, glaring at Mime. What was that for? Mime, her expression serious, shook her head, pointed a claw at the nest, and then pointed the same claw toward her open mouth. Watching as Mime patted her stomach and licked her lips, Mark held up his hand in defeat. Okay, I get it. They're food, not friends. With a firm nod, Mime turned her attention back to the stalagmite and the rippling black mass atop it. From where he was crouched, Mark couldn't see either Batten or Phoenix. But it wasn't long before his comm crackled to life, and he heard Phoenix's whisper. I'm in position. I see the button, and I'm ready to push on your command.
It'll take me another 2 or 3 minutes,
came Batten's reply. In truth, Mark didn't mind the waiting, as the cavern was quiet and peaceful. None of the fierce fighting engulfing the rest of the facility had made it down into the cavern, though Mark imagined it would only be a matter of time. Nests were a prime target for Exlian they hadn't produced, and considering multiple incredibly powerful Exlian from different sources were roaming the facility, it was a sure bet that they would eventually clash, just as the giant crab and the lightning leech had. Mark was especially curious about how the Bailiff would fight. Given its nature, it wasn't nearly as strong in direct combat, But it had its advantages, too. Since it was composed of plants, it never had to rest, and though its combat power was relatively weak, it used swarm tactics to great effect. Thinking about the Bailiff got Mark thinking about the necro seeds. He couldn't help but lick his lips as he remembered how eating them had improved his will stat. Part of Mark wondered if it would be better not to destroy the facility, but instead to use it to farm stats. He hadn't eaten enough leeches yet to know what stats they would give him, but he could imagine that they would focus on speed. Between the Bailiff and the nest, there was a good chance he could produce an endless number of them. If he focused on culling their numbers, keeping them manageable, he could eat as many as he wanted, and who knew how high his stats could rise. Then there was the crab. Mark was quite confident that killing it and eating it would produce a drastic increase in his strength. After all, a single snap of the monster's claws was enough to shatter concrete with the sound blast alone. Lost in his daydream, Mark almost missed Batten's signal.
3, 2, 1.
As both of the emergency shutoff buttons were punched at the same time, Mark realized he hadn't yet figured out how he was going to distract the nest. As he hesitated, a siren suddenly began to wail, shattering the peace that filled the cavern. A red light began to flash, casting a strobe effect that dyed the surrounding mist a deep crimson. The nest reacted immediately, surging upward and pulling its bulk together as it began sweeping this way and that, searching for the source of the sound. From its reaction, Mark imagined that it might have experienced this situation before. He wouldn't be surprised if, when the soldiers had shut down the facility, they had attempted to kill the nest as well. After all, if they were eliminating the program, it would have made sense to eliminate the primary subject, too. Mark could feel the nest's anger pulsing, and lightning began to erupt from the pool around it. The massive leech let out a keening wail that mixed with the harsh siren. Seeing the nest shifting toward the observation booth where Phoenix was currently crouched under the window, Mark knew he had to act, fast. He let out a loud shout, which was drowned out by the blaring sounds, and jumped from his hiding place to sprint toward the pool. He had no idea what he would do when he got there, but he knew that surges in mana were the most effective path to attracting the nest's attention. Though he lacked a flashy, mana-heavy move like Phoenix, he still knew how to move mana around. As he ran, he did his best to pull as much mana from his surroundings as possible. His only goal was to create as big a disturbance as he could, and by the time he plunged into the thick cloud of mana that surrounded the stalagmite, he could feel it beginning to swirl around him. Mark had never been in an environment so rich in mana, and he nearly faltered as it poured into his body. As he charged toward the nest, the tall black pillar of quivering flesh shifted toward him, sensing his arrival through the disturbance he caused. The nest wasn't the only thing that spotted Mark. The terror-ranked leech's eye stalk twisted around, fixing its gaze on him. With lightning cascading off its shell, the leech rotated its bulk surprisingly quickly and charged toward Mark like a speeding freight train, throwing up sheets of charged water. Thankfully, the leeches could only travel quickly in a straight line. Mark would have been crushed. He noticed its attention a moment before it attacked and instinctively dove to the side. Only 6 seconds had passed since the alarm had sounded, leaving 4 more until the mana conduits were shut off. Though that was hardly enough time to think, to Mark, each second felt like an eternity. He felt his shoulders slamming into the ground as he dove out of the massive lightning leech's path. Borrowing the rebounding force, Mark bounced up just as another large leech, its shell sending out massive arcs of lightning, charged toward him. Though he managed to dodge its snapping teeth, the edge of its shell brushed against his ribs. The contact burned his flesh as lightning danced across him, sending him tumbling to the side. It took him a second to control his muscles, which were vibrating violently as the powerful electricity tore through them. And before he could regain his balance, the massive leech unleashed a thick bolt of lightning toward his chest. Mark got his arms up just in time, covering his head and neck, but as it struck his arms, the bolt spread out and splashed around them, drenching Mark in millions of volts. Blasted backward, Mark could feel his entire body cooking. There was a strange pop, and it was only after he hit the ground that he realized one of his eyeballs had burst. The lightning was so intense that Mark's brain didn't catch up to the pain until another second had passed. When it did, a terrible scream was wrenched from Mark's lips. At the same time, the blaring alarm cut off, and with a dying hum, the mana conduit rapidly dried up. The air shook as the nest let out a silent scream, its body vibrating at a tremendous rate that seemed to match the horrific pain raging through Mark's body. 37. Hearing Mark's scream, Phoenix jumped to her feet, peering down at the cavern below. Before she could spot him, however, the nest spotted her, and all its rage fixed on her. Phoenix knew they were both in trouble. Even as she summoned her shields to try to defend against whatever it would throw, she found the mana that normally readily obeyed her call began to rebel. She had never experienced anything like it in her life, and it left her frozen in fear as the nest forcefully took control of all the mana surrounding her, locking her in a bubble of pure force and waving a long tendril up into the air. The mana around Phoenix began to boil. With a shriek, Phoenix was pulled straight through the glass and steel front of the observation room, the mana in front of her melting away everything that obstructed her. She felt suffocated and found herself entirely paralyzed as she was dragged out into the open. The nest, clearly furious, lifted a second tendril, then another, until 4 waving arms extended from the top of the black mass. One of them controlled Phoenix as the others began to sweep through the area, seeming to look for any way to turn the mana flow back on. Down on the ground, Mark's body lay twitching, lightning still occasionally jumping between his limbs and his torso. Watching all of this from the observation room above, Batten crouched, trembling with no idea what to do. Seeing how easily Phoenix had been shut down, he was genuinely at a loss. Though he had tremendous strength, what good would that do against a monster who could control mana so freely? Still, he had to do something. Summoning his courage, he burst out of the door and hopped over the railing, falling 15 feet to the catwalk below. He landed with enough force to warp it, but didn't stop as he jumped down again to the catwalk just above the cavern floor. The nest had already noticed, but it simply waved one of its tendrils in his direction, causing the smaller leeches to shriek and throw themselves toward him. With a roar, Batten met the leeches, his fists flying and his teeth gritted as he tried to fight through the storm of lightning to reach Phoenix. She was still hanging in the air, fighting with all her might to break free from the nest's control. No matter how she struggled, however, it was like smashing herself against a concrete wall. The nest used little to no finesse, simply brute force, overwhelming control, and a tremendous flow of mana to completely oppress Phoenix, trapping her in her own power. The tendril controlling the mana around Phoenix shifted, and she began to slowly float toward the black mass on the stalagmite. Just as she was starting to truly despair, she caught sight of a hint of movement. Though she couldn't turn her head to see what was happening, it was clear that the nest had noticed the movement as well, and it shifted its attention. The orb of pure mana around her froze, and she hung suspended in the air like an insect trapped in a drop of amber. There was a loud crash, and the wall caved in. Then a deafening click echoed through the cavern, and 2 figures tumbled into the room. Supported by Kinsey, Lieutenant Langford was in rough shape, but despite his wounds, he shrugged off Kinsey's grip and took a staggering step forward. With a sharp cry, a massive, battle-scarred crab shoved its way into the room, its wide body bashing into the edges of the hole it had created as it forced its way into the cavern. Though it was missing half a claw and covered in wounds, the giant crab was undeterred. It glared down at Langford and Kinsey, but just as it was about to launch an attack, a thick bolt of lightning slammed into it, sending it reeling. A moment later, the giant leech was on top of it, resuming their apocalyptic battle. Pure fury erupted from the crab, and it spun around, using the jagged edges of its shell to tear against the giant leech's body. Between the leech's sharp teeth and the jagged blade edge of the crab's carapace, it was as if two saws had met, sending sparks flying. Langford and Kinsey, shocked by the sudden development, looked around, finally realizing where they had stumbled. Catching sight of Phoenix hanging in the air and Batten fighting desperately against a horde of lightning leeches, the two ranger officers sprang into action. Langford headed for the nest with no hesitation, while Kinsey raced around the stalagmite to get Batten into view. Skidding to a stop, she extended her right hand, gripping her wrist with her left. A green glow lit up her palm, and a similar glow erupted around Batten, covering his body and rapidly healing the wounds he had suffered. While she was supporting Batten, Langford had gotten close to the nest. Like most empowered who fought with telekinesis, he used mana-charged blades, creating a storm of rapid attacks that could shred just about anything. Unfortunately, as he charged toward the nest, his blades completely failed him. They shot forward, only to grind to a halt, as if stuck in the very air itself. The blue mana that shrouded them began to shift and warp, and then, one by one, the blades were extinguished, falling with plops into the water below. Stunned, Langford stumbled as his connection with the shurikens was cut off. But before he could retreat, one of the nest's waving arms pointed down at him, and a torrent of mana coalesced from the thick mist above the mana lake and blasted into him, sending him tumbling across the floor. Gritting his teeth, Langford jumped up. Though the blow had been hard, he was an A-ranked empowered. With an angry roar, he charged back into battle, determined to kill the nest if it was the last thing he did. The leech and the crab, resuming their epic feud, slammed their bodies together, biting, clawing, and bashing with relentless force. Thankfully, with the intensity of their fight, they had no time to spare for the Rangers. But currently, it didn't seem to matter, as the nest continued to fight everyone. Still locked up by the mana, Phoenix was finding it harder and harder to breathe as the orb around her began to constrict, while across the cavern, Batten's fight against the leeches had finally stabilized. Yet it was impossible for him to break through, as every time he would try to smash one of them, two more would attack him from the back. The leeches seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how to work together, and rather than just attacking in a disorganized mess as most Exlian did, they coordinated their attacks, rotating to cover each other's recharge periods. Kinsey was desperately trying to keep Batten healthy while also sparing the occasional spell for Langford. Unfortunately, she had already been fighting for almost an hour without stopping, and her energy was starting to run low. Just then, she saw Mark roll over onto his side. Originally, she had assumed that he was dead, nothing but a scorched corpse, a view reinforced by the wisps of smoke rising from his flesh. Now, seeing him move, she gritted her teeth and forced out a bit more power, sending a surge of healing energy toward him. Power surged through him like spring rain soaking the dried earth, and Mark's scorched flesh returned to a perfect state. His burst eyeball rapidly reformed, and a minute later he blinked, his vision restored. The pain that had shaken his body faded to a memory, and Mark sat up with a jerk. Nobody saw him, however, as at the same moment, a portion of the cavern's ceiling fell in with a crash, burying half of the catwalks in a massive wave of stone and dirt. A writhing sea of vines appeared through the dust, and for a brief moment, everyone in the cavern froze as the Bailiff's main body made its entrance.
I don't think they're supposed to get that big. They're not supposed to get that big, are they?
Kinsey said in horror, pointing at the 40-foot-high wall of vegetation that was creeping toward the center of the cavern.
No, Langford said. They're certainly not. But they're also not supposed to have an unlimited supply of mana.
Recognizing the new threat, the nest waved one of its arms, and the leeches that had been fighting against Batten rapidly abandoned their struggle, turning their attention to this new foe. At the same time, the massive lightning leech disengaged with the crab, turning and becoming a blur as it shot across the cavern to smash into the approaching wall of vines. Absolutely enraged, the crab lifted its good claw and let out a bloodthirsty cry. Yet even as it turned its attention to the nest, A slithering sound behind it caused it to turn as more vines began to pour out of the hole it had created in the cavern wall. Recognizing the bailiff as a new threat against the nest, the crab screeched in anger and threw itself into battle, tearing through the vines with relentless sweep.